Well, this is a very special moment. I first met Roger as a graduate student, and I was experiencing a sort of early wave of the cancel culture that now is prevalent on most university campuses. And Roger, at that time, having already worked in the 70s and 80s with the likes of Jessica Douglas Home, who is here, and others in the West who were supporting the dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, he recognized what it was like to be interested in the world of ideas and to be suppressed. And so he was our earliest advisor at Common Sense Society beginning in 2009. His generosity of spirit and the time he spent speaking, often for no pay and sometimes paying for his own travel. He was a dear friend and a mentor of my now wife, then a student, and mine, and it is a tremendous privilege to be able, with our Council of Trustees at the Common Sense Society and with the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, and most of all with Sophie Scruton, to establish this prize. And with that, I want to welcome to the stage Fisher Dedarian, who is the Executive Director and a former student of Roger Scruton's. He's the Executive Director of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, and of course, Lady Scruton, Roger's widow. And so with that, and Sophie is also, of course, one of our trustees. And as has already been discussed, this inaugural award is going to Dr. Jordan Peterson, who has stood courageously for freedom of academic inquiry and against the assault on language and critical thinking. Through his lectures and writings, he has provided an entire generation of young people around the world with access to the wellsprings of our civilization, and they have responded by the millions. Dr. Peterson's message is one of personal responsibility and gratitude, a path out of the mire of envy and strife that characterizes so much of media and public life today. He warns of the dangers of ideology on all sides of the political arena. His message calling us to build fulfilling lives and stable communities is one that is desperately needed today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the inaugural Sir Roger Scruton Prize laureate, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson.
So I listened to Governor DeSantis talk about the honorable nature of the trades, and I was thinking about what to say when I got up here, and two phrases entered my mind. One was two ideas. One was that Christ was a carpenter, and the other was that Sir Karl Popper's words, that thought allows our ideas to die in our stead. And you might think, what could possibly be the relationship between those two ideas? And Neil Ferguson talked about freedom of speech. And one of the things that I see us doing very wrong in our society, even those of us who are, let's say, firmly on the side of freedom of speech, is to think about freedom of speech, first of all, in some sense as a freedom, and second of all, as of one freedom among many. And this is not the case. The reason that Christ is a carpenter is because a carpenter builds something. And a good carpenter is allied with the truth, because otherwise the house that he builds will not stand. Now, at the same time, the Logos is the centerpiece of a productive, prosperous, and free society. And that's because freedom of speech is no different from freedom of thought. And I mean that technically, because much of what we do that we think of as thinking is a form of, and you can receive an answer if you formulate the question carefully. But you can also divide yourself into multiple competing parties simultaneously engaging in internal discussion and analyze and strengthen and edit and revise the ideas that manifest themselves to you. And as Popper said, we can generate alternative fictional representations of ourselves through thought. We can play out the consequences of the modes of being that that thought represents, and if they result in our fictional demise, we can not act them out. And so what that means is that thought is the alternative to painful death, and that freedom of speech is indistinguishable from thought. Now, it doesn't seem unreasonable to propose that thought is the mechanism by which errors are corrected. It doesn't seem unreasonable to propose that we engage in the process of the correction of errors in the context of dialogue between opposing opinions, but it isn't precisely because we should be free to do that that it's necessary that we're free to do that. It's necessary that we're free to do that so that everything around us doesn't degenerate continually into an ossified totalitarian hell, or fragment into a chaos that could envelop us all. I see conservatives often, in more recent years, talk about viewpoint diversity. And there's a certain pride of discovery that goes along with that utterance, which is, now we've turned the table on those radicals. They're pro-diversity. What about diversity of speech? And I think, you lost the battle before you opened your mouth. You made speech itself and the freedom of speech nothing but another form of diversity. You subordinated the highest to the lowest, let's say. That's not a wise strategy, and it's based on a misapprehension both of the nature of thought and of the nature of speech itself. Speech is freedom of speech as a manifestation of the recognition of the importance of the logos is the precondition for the construction of states and their repair. It's a mechanism. It's the fundamental mechanism of adaptation. That's the bluntest way to put it. And in some sense, you don't even have freedom of speech in a free society, although you do. What you have is a sacred obligation to be responsible for the truth of your utterances. And perhaps you're free to do that, right? You're free to follow your conscience as it guides your speech. But that's not so that you can say whatever you want to say. It's not something to be conceptualized as mere freedom from constraint, even though it is also that. It's a recognition of the necessity for that free voice to operate so that the complex problems that beset us, that cannot merely be solved as a consequence of mindless application of what worked in the past, it's the very process by which we adapt to a future which is literally different than the past. There isn't another way of doing it except through death. You can act out your ideas, and if they're wrong, they can kill you, and that can be a form of progress, although it's very hard on those that merely die. The alternative to that, the alternative to conflict, the alternative to stagnation and chaos, is thought itself, mediated through free speech. And it's very important for those who ally themselves with the idea of free speech as a fundamental virtue to understand that it's not to be defended as one freedom among many, and it's certainly not to be thought of as a kind of luxury of choice. It's far more fundamental than that. It's an honor to be selected for this prize, to follow in the footsteps of Sir Roger Scruton, because he understood this. He understood as well that our allegiance to beauty and perhaps our desire for prosperity were also manifestations of something that was extraordinarily fundamental about and related to the proper orientation of human societies. But I think it is necessary to understand that above all else, it's the capacity for thought that maintains the viability of our societies and gives rise to them to begin with. It's the mechanism by which societies are built, and it's the mechanism by which they repair themselves when they fall into error. That's mediated through communal thought, the agent of which is free speech. The reason it works is because people are genuinely different. That's a nod to diversity, let's say, in the truest sense. The horizon of the future differs from the predictability of the past. The means of adaptation to that transforming horizon are literally uncomputable and unpredictable a priori, because the world is not deterministic in its most fundamental aspect. And as a consequence, we have to continually engage in the process of a dynamic thought, which is an embodiment of truth itself, to stay on the ragged edge of progress and disaster, and to propagate ourselves properly, healthy and together at the individual level, the familial level, and the community level, and onward into the future. And so it's very necessary to get these sorts of things right and to understand exactly what it is that we're dealing with here, and not to fall into the trap of making weak arguments for the sanctity of free speech when the strongest possible arguments can be made, and those arguments involve the literal generation of the structures of civilization themselves and their recasting into ever more perfect forms as we move forward into the unpredictable future. And so it's knowing this, although perhaps not quite as clearly as I did until today, that's made me believe that saying what I have to say is the most important possible thing, not because it means that I have a libertine freedom to shoot off my mouth, let's say, but because I know full well that without the manifestation of that truth in speech, that everything around us is threatened, and everything around us is threatened and potentially crumbles. And you're a fool if you want that to happen, and more than a fool. And so, thank you very much for all coming tonight, and thank you to the Common Sense Society for honoring me with this Signal Award, and I'll do everything I can to live up to what it represents as I propagate myself, hopefully, into the future. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. Yeah.